cannot be a great leader without investing in your own development. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of people do. A lot of people take that responsibility very seriously. But I think because of the traditional corporate business climate, there's this aspect that people say, well, I've been doing this a long time. I have been leading people for over 30 years. I still invest in my own learning. I still have things to learn. I still pick up things and try different things and look at things a different way, or figure out, hey, that's a great idea that somebody else is doing and I'm going to try that.
Yeah.
And the only way that you can continue, again, that infinite learner, continue to grow is to accept that responsibility. Hey everybody, welcome to Finding the Upside. Thank you so much for joining us today. Today we have a special episode that's part of our new series that we launched a couple of weeks ago called Creating Leaders. And normally I am interviewing leaders that are shaping the new wave of leaders and changing leadership style and approach that we have today in business and in our society. But today, Liyana is with me, and she is going to be interviewing me. So thank you for being here. Thanks, Liyana, for doing this series. It's nice to be on the receiving end.
Yes, I'm excited.
Okay, awesome. So shoot, you have the floor.
All right. So question number 1 is, can you describe your non-traditional approach to leadership and what inspired you to focus on building confidence and breathing possibility into your team?
So, firstly, that is the premise of this series, is really highlighting leaders and people who are changing how leadership is done.
Yep.
And as you know, one of my things that I believe in wholeheartedly is I take a non-traditional approach to leadership, which I call rebel leadership. And it really goes against the grain of what corporate business is like. I believe in that wholeheartedly.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to help others adopt that. And anybody that's on this series definitely subscribes to that.
Yeah.
So how I approach it is, there's a typical thing that I talk about all the time that's called corporate think, right? Which doesn't really provide a place of belonging where people can be themselves and feel comfortable to make mistakes, to be who they are, to be able to speak up, even if it's kind of disagreeing with things that are being decided upon or talk about. And although corporate nowadays, not 15 years ago when I left that world, nowadays talks about creating safe psychological spaces, a lot of it is done from a very tokenism standpoint. They say that.
Yeah.
But they're still operating in this mode of really having armored leadership, and that's a Brene Brown term, which means not authentic, not vulnerable, not creating places of belonging. So my belief is that I believe in always, and I always have, creating a place where everybody feels valued, where everyone can learn, make mistakes, grow. And that really changes that traditional leadership approach, which talks about disciplining people and writing people up. And I'm not saying that that necessarily doesn't have to still get done from time to time.
Yeah.
But really, I think the basis of it is it puts more of the emphasis on building the relationship and creating the culture where people feel those things, and guess what? Then they are the most effective and contribute at the highest level. It actually works better.
Yeah. So touching on that, and you just mentioned culture and building a culture. How do you cultivate a culture where team members feel confident to take risks, innovate, and challenge the status quo?
Well, I think that it is all about, the leader or the leaders setting the tone. And it's some of the things that I mentioned in the last question, but really to illustrate that is creating that environment and that safe space where mistakes are not disciplined and there's no punitive action for mistakes, that you create the environment because it's time to learn.
Yeah.
And really providing the structure. So the culture, there's so many things that play into culture. it's the norms of how people interact with one another.
Yeah.
It's also though the leader taking, or the leaders taking the steps to take the responsibility and ownership that that's theirs to strike and set that tone.
Yeah.
And it really does, if I had to like distill it all down to the simplest terms, it really is being in a place or providing a place where people feel safe, cared for, and supported.
Yeah.
It sounds so simple, because I remember like I had been asked to give a talk about leadership, and it was for people that aren't necessarily you probably wouldn't even self-identify as a leader because they don't have a title of leader. And I actually say, no, everyone is a leader if you think about what the foundation of leadership is. And I thought, what do I need to tell them? Well, I really told them 4 things. And it was, these are the most important things in leadership, was to invest in others, stand in their belief gap, make sure they feel supported and cared for, and that they can show up authentically and be who they are. And again, that sounds so simple, but every action has to strive and aspire to do that, because without that, personally, I've been on the receiving end of that in my early corporate days. And then I always had to, well, even throughout my corporate days, I had to make a decision, which I did, that even though I'm not being led in a way that I want to be led, I'm going to lead differently for my team. And obviously, when I created my own company, I was able to have the freedom to carry that through because I found it worked much better.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So what strategies or practices do you employ to help team members see beyond their current capabilities and imagine greater possibilities within their organizations?
So I'm glad that you asked that question. What I want to say is that, I think that's something that so many people that I am working with and, working amongst right now, we are so aligned on that.
Yeah.
And so Sal Rometta, who was here a couple of weeks ago in the Creating Leaders series, we talk about that a lot.
Yeah.
And he spoke about that in his interview, is breathing possibility into others. And I think that goes to what I said just in the answer to the last question, was standing in people's belief gap, which is people may not even envision themselves to be able to be more or something. And to be able to breathe possibility into them, I think that you have to invest in them, number one.
Yeah.
Right? You have to invest in them and actually care about where they're going or what they want to achieve, and actually inquire about, what are your long-term goals, or what do you see yourself? And when you see someone who has a very small vision of what's possible for them, is to continue to plant those seeds and encourage them to be able to see that they can be much more, and that possibility, like breathe that possibility into them, that they can achieve more, be more. If it's within your company that they're working for you, if they're working for me, and beyond that, right? And that's, as I said, those 4 tenets of leadership is really doing that for someone.
Yeah.
And what Sal and I were talking about a couple weeks ago was, and I've said this over and over again, that is actually the most rewarding part for me, and he agreed, of leadership, is seeing somebody actually become more than they imagined. Like, that's the most rewarding part.
Yeah.
So that's always my intention, is to instill that.
Yeah. Yeah, I love what you said, and I love that episode you did with Sal. Everyone should go watch it. Episode 84. But now I kind of want to talk about Simon Sinek, and he talks about the infinite game of business. How do you apply this mindset to lead effectively in environments that are consistently evolving?
So he talks about the infinite game from so many different angles, and Simon Sinek is definitely somebody that I subscribe to, him as a thought leader with leadership. I think a lot of people who align, with my beliefs and what I believe in terms of being a leader and how to lead do as well.
Yeah.
But I want to say first, because we've mentioned his name, he was not really gaining traction until about 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Maybe a little bit more, because of course he started with the Start With Why, which that was kind of bigger than leadership. It was just business as Start With Why, like, why are you doing something? And really in your marketing even, so he gained traction for that. But in the leadership, thought leader from leadership, he talks about all of these things that I believe in. And he talks about that, being a leader has nothing to do with the title, right?
Yeah.
I talk about that as well, right?
Yeah.
And that it's so crazy that we have this flawed model of leadership that still exists, that he is obviously putting different messages out there, and I am as well. There's lots of people that it doesn't work well.
Yeah.
And so the infinite game, as he talks about, is with regard to leadership. How I'd like to answer this, he talks about being an infinite learner. Now, being an infinite learner is a given, right? In life, you should be that, right? And he also talks about how, as a leader, you have to be an infinite learner, and you have to become a student of leadership.
Yeah.
100% those principles apply not only to myself, because leadership doesn't come as something that you just automatically have. It's something that you have to invest in your own skills, invest in your own learning of that, how to make it work better, etc. And all of the education you need to invest in to become a good and great leader.
Yep.
And our model in business, people don't generally get promoted to a leadership position because they're a good leader. In fact, they get promoted because they're good at their job.
Yeah.
And that doesn't come with any training typically on how to be a good leader. So as being a student of leadership is taking that responsibility yourself, taking that ownership, and taking the responsibility to develop potential in people.
Yeah.
Take care of people to the left and right of you.
Yep.
Right? So I wholeheartedly, apply that in everything I do. But I think when he states the infinite game relative to this, he talks about that having, and I term it this way, leadership is not often thought of. If you had to say one thing, it's you're responsible for somebody's life.
Yeah.
And we don't think about it that way, but if you think about that everything you do has an impact on whether they're going to become what they fully can or not, then that's the infinite game. If you can impact somebody's life in a positive way, that they grow beyond what they thought was possible, the infinite game is your efforts are going well beyond what you're doing today, because that's the ripple effect of impacting that person, and then everybody they impact, and so on and so on.
Yeah.
And so those are really the foundations that drive my belief and everything that I do and everything that I practice, and I strive to do that.
Yeah. So I kind of want to stay with Simon Sinek for a second. Him, as well as Brené Brown, talked about the importance of personal growth in leadership. What are some habits or practices you've adopted to ensure continuous personal and professional development?
Such a great question, and one that I hope that anybody kind of, takes ownership of or takes responsibility for. In order to lead, you cannot be a great leader without investing in your own development. And unfortunately, I think that a lot of people do. A lot of people take that responsibility very seriously. But I think because of the traditional corporate business climate, there's this aspect that people say, well, I've been doing this a long time. I have been leading people for over 30 years. I still invest in my own learning. I still have things to learn. I still pick up things and try different things and look at things a different way, or figure out, hey, that's a great idea that somebody else is doing, and I'm going to try that.
Yeah.
And the only way that you can continue, again, that infinite learner, continue to grow, is to accept that responsibility.
Yeah.
And it's not just a responsibility, I think, that everyone should have, because I think we all should invest in our own growth.
Agreed.
But if your role, and you accept your role to impact others, then it's necessary.
Yeah.
It's necessary. So I think that there's more people who are accepting that and taking ownership of that, but all of us need to. And if you think about what I said about how leaders become leaders, if we look at two things, it's either they're promoted because they were good at their job,
yep,
or, and this is a lot of clients I work with, business owners started a company.
Yep.
Doesn't make them a great leader. And they often are misled to think, well, I own the company, so I'm the leader. But do you really have the training and or knowledge and or practice to do that?
Yeah.
And a lot of them are failing and not realizing that all of the conditions that they're experiencing with staff leaving and staff problems and turnover and mistakes and lack of customer engagement and lack of employee engagement has more to do with what they're doing than what the people are doing.
Yeah. So I want to ask you, how do you measure the success of your leadership style, especially in terms of team growth and team development?
Well, I mean, it is definitely something that has to be in the forefront of what you're doing, right?
Yep.
Because to be honest, effectiveness of what you're doing and the approach you're having is you have to be in touch with what's happening in your team and in your company. And you could have a group of people that are on your team where your style and your approach is working just fine. And then you could have somebody new join and it could not work at all. And that could also start to create some dynamic that isn't as effective, efficient, cohesive. And as a leader, you always have to have the ability to assess what's happening, right? What is the dynamic? Now, it's not an easy thing that I can say to you, do this, and this, and you're always golden. It really isn't.
Yeah.
So in truth, over 30 years, there's times that I have soared. There's times that I struggled.
Yeah.
But I think it's the commitment to assessing what you're doing, is it effective, and how I usually measure it is I take the temperature of my staff, and that's ebbs and flows, right? And I don't, listen, we're all human, right? We all have good days and bad days. We all have good weeks and bad weeks.
Yeah.
But if something is off, you have to take that as a data point and say, what's happening?
Yeah.
Right? And then you have to keep an eye on it, and you have to inquire, and you have to talk to your team members. And this is the thing that I think is the most important thing is, in traditional business, a lot of times we're like, wait, what? I have to get to know them? I have to spend time with them?
Yeah.
Yes. You're dealing with human beings, right? And so somebody having kind of a shutdown attitude could just be something that's happening in their life. Maybe they're frustrated, maybe they're tired, maybe they're a little burnt out. But you've got to take that in and say, if this continues, I'm going to inquire about it. What's going on, right?
Yeah.
And so I think in the simplest terms, that's how I make sure what I'm doing is effective, is just keeping an eye and staying in touch with my team members and not getting upset if it's like one day somebody's off or a little bit of time somebody's off.
Yeah.
Because that could just be an anomaly, right? Like just something happening. But having the relationship and also, as I've said before, creating that forum and that safe space for them to be able to tell you what's happening.
Yeah.
Right?
Definitely.
Because there could be things that are impacting that if they don't feel safe to speak up, then you're never going to know.
Yep.
So I think it's not a recipe, it's an art, but it's constantly being aware and doing check-ins and kind of monitoring and asking yourself questions like, oh, I got a little upset the other day, maybe that put them off,
Yeah.
And it really is a relationship. That's the thing I wanted to bring out. It's a relationship.
Yeah.
Sometimes when I say that to traditional, corporate people, they're like, what do you mean? Yeah, you're in a relationship with your team.
Yep.
And just like any relationship, there's going to be ebbs and flows, but there's investments. There's deposits and withdrawals. That's what I always like to say.
Yeah, yeah.
Right? You make deposits and they flourish. You make withdrawals, you got to make another deposit. So it's a dynamic and it's an exchange.
Yeah. So speaking of in terms of team growth, can you share a specific instance where boosting your team's confidence led to a breakthrough or significant achievement?
Oh, wow. Well, one that comes to mind is, and it's quite some time ago, actually, but there's been many, thankfully. But one story is Anthony worked for me. And I'll tell you that at the time, he came to interview, and it was he was working at a competitive firm.
Yeah.
And he wanted to move up to the next step, and he wasn't being given the opportunity where he was, and all the other competitive firms that he shopped, to try to get hired, turned him down and wouldn't hire him. And while I was interviewing him, I just saw something, call it a knowing, or maybe just some potential, just in the way he held himself, that I was like, I'm going to give this guy a shot. Because I really felt like there was something in him, that I was seeing. And I probably also felt like, why wouldn't anybody give him a chance? This wasn't a high-level position he was being hired for.
Yeah.
But it was the next step.
Yep.
And in that industry at the time, you were kind of a sales assistant, and then you moved to a research analyst, and that was the position I was interviewing him for. And he ultimately wanted to be a salesperson, a TV rep, which is selling advertising time, right? Working at advertising agencies. And that's the industry I worked in that time. And so I was managing a lot of people in these research analyst positions, and they were all at the same level. And I was like, why wouldn't somebody give him the opportunity, right?
Yep.
Why would they say no? So I was like, I'm going to give him a shot.
Okay.
He was completely transparent, saying that he knew, because that was the path. Then it was, you were a sales assistant, you were a research analyst.
Yeah.
Then you pitched the sales training program, which was a whole process.
Yep.
And then you went through that sales training program, which was a 6-month training program, and then you became a sales rep. Okay. Right?
Yep.
And it was a very coveted kind of role, to aspire to, and it was very selective.
Okay.
So he was very transparent that that's what he ultimately wanted, and he knew he needed to do his time in this position.
Yeah.
And he was great, trained him, helped him kind of learn the ropes and start working. And in this kind of path that he wanted, I guess you would say that I became a mentor to him. He's like, well, who should I go and meet? Because it was like that kind of thing where you have to meet people and build relationships so people knew who you were when you pitch the training program, because then they're going to make a selection. They're only going to pick 4 people. And so I gave him the support that I could. I really invested in having him be able to get what he wanted. Yeah. And a lot of it was really cultivating relationships, but also having a strategy. How do I get seen? Because it really was that kind of climate where you needed to get seen. Yeah. And so I gave him my best advice and counseled him with that. And what was interesting was he did a great job for me. He got to know, obviously, on my team, all of the salespeople and the sales managers. Yep. And then what I had suggested was he also was a musician and had a band. And so our company had a huge Christmas party every year. Yeah. And I said, you know what you should do? You should go pitch that you would be the band for the Christmas party, but do it for free. Because then all of these people are going to have their eyes on you at the Christmas party.
Yeah.
All of them are going to know, because we'll make sure they know, that you work on the green team. That was my team.
Yep.
And that you were a research analyst. And then when you go to pitch the training program, the sales training program, they're going to go, hey, that's the guy that played in the band at the Christmas party.
Yeah.
She's like, oh my God, that's a great idea. I just have to get my bandmates to agree. I was like, take them out to dinner, you pay them, whatever. Like,
yeah.
This would be like, he's like, yeah, that's a great idea. So he pitched, and they accepted, and it was at a great place, right? And I'll never forget the day that I walked in. And this was all part of the long-term plan that I was just, he was doing the job for me, but I was helping him along the way to kind of achieve this. And I walked into the place, he was already set up, and it was a great place in Manhattan where it was 2 levels, and there was a huge bar on the lower level, and then there was this staircase that went up to like an area where you could look down in this. And they put the band in this little corner on the top floor where barely anybody could see them. So as soon as I walked up the stairs, I'm turning to look where he is, and I see him, and his face was like this. And I was like, oh, that's not a good location, right?
Yeah.
So the party started filling up, and he was playing, right? And he was singing because he was the lead singer.
Yeah.
And I'd seen him at because he asked me to come and see him and his band play. And I saw how crazy he got, where he would like stand on tables and, really get the crowd going. And he was being very reserved, right? Because I also feel like physically, they kind of put him in this corner, and he was kind of like feeling like, here, I'm trapped here, right?
Yeah.
So as he's singing, I'm looking at him, and I go, meaning, go downstairs and get on the bar. Get on the bar, because when you were looking down, that's all you saw was the bar. And if you were on the first floor, you couldn't not look at somebody that was there, because that was going to grab a lot of attention. And he was like, huh? And then he was like, oh. And he did. My God. Like, what a show.
Yeah.
And everybody looked at him. And everybody was like, oh my God, wasn't that great? Like, oh my God, he's crazy. Like, oh my God, he works on the green team.
Yeah.
So it worked. And it was a series of months that he had to be prepped, and I helped him, prep for the interviews. And he went on the interviews, and he pitched, and he got in. And fast forward, he worked in that company as a sales rep. He got placed on the very same team. Yeah. The green team sales team, right? So, and then his career took lots of different turns because of industry changing. TV rep business is very different. Actually, doesn't even exist today.
Yeah.
And so he grew with different opportunities with .com and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
And fast forward to today, he is I believe the CEO of a major data company.
Oh, wow.
And so much where I remember he sent me a picture where he was ringing the bell on Wall Street, for his company.
Yeah.
So when I think about that story and that where he is, and I think about how he didn't even believe in himself because he was so worn down because of how he was treated at all those other firms. And this isn't like, oh, Maria, look what you did. It was really about standing in his belief gap until he believed in himself and helping to support him, so that really creating that bridge for him to get to the next place where he wanted to go.
Yeah.
And I tell that story because that was one of the most rewarding things for me, is to see him succeed. But also, I think it brings out the foundations of what I'm talking about, of what true leadership creates. Yeah. And that's what this series is about, is having enough people doing that to create more leaders, because he is a true leader. Whether he had people working for him or not, or, any of those things, he stepped into that possibility and stepped into that potential that he had all that time. And if he encountered somebody else, maybe that wouldn't have happened. So,
yeah, that's an incredible story. I've heard that a few times now, and I love hearing it. So I'm glad we shared it today.
Yeah.
Given today's rapidly changing work environments, how has your leadership approach evolved to remain effective and relevant?
So I think although the workplace environments have changed, right? And this is what I'm going to say, because I'm going to take it in this direction. You tell me if I'm answering your question. But, let's just talk about the obvious here, right? The workplace environment, I think after COVID, first of all, we're dealing mostly with a hybrid kind of format, right? A lot of remote work. Some people talk about that like that's a new thing.
Yeah.
I'll say that in my last corporate position, which is 15 plus years ago, my last 5 years at Nielsen Company, I had team members working for me, and 0 of them worked in the same physical location as me. They worked in different parts of the country.
Yeah.
So, well, I do think there are challenges to leading in that type of environment, right? That you have to be aware of, because you don't have that unity where you're face to face with someone. People can tend to feel isolated because they're not in the same place. And so I think that you've got to evolve your style to not be blind to that. And how do I create that unity, right, and cohesiveness when not everybody might be in the same place at the same time?
Yeah.
So why I think it's important to be real about this, that this is not new. It's not new, right? For years, people have worked in different locations for companies. So this was always a challenge. And I think in my experience with business, I started working at a time where tons of money was spent to bring people together to sales meetings and conferences and, company retreats. And although that's done today, it's not done as widely, and there's been lots of cuts to those type of budget, line items in companies.
Yeah.
But I do think that you've definitely got to at least recognize that in that hybrid, remote, kind of spread out space, unity and cohesiveness is something that takes intention to develop. But I would also say that just because everybody's in the same physical space doesn't mean that they're a cohesive team.
Yeah.
And there's that. So I think it's the touch points with staff. It's not the events where you order pizza, although that's nice. It's really what is the culture and the climate, and what is the feeling people get, right?
Yeah.
What is the feeling of connectedness, and how do you achieve that? And I think as a leader in today's day and age, that's one of the major evolutions, is that so much emphasis needs to be placed on how do we achieve that in this new climate. The other thing I'll say is, and I hope I'm answering your question, but the other thing I'll say is, I understand that in the corporate world, there's lots of challenges with, you have acquisitions and mergers, so there's staff reductions all the time, right? That can get tough, because every time a team member leaves or a group of team members leave, it could change the dynamic.
Yep.
We have to address that front and center, right? If that's the nature of the business, I do think it makes it harder for a leader to create that environment. But I would also say the companies that are striking the right balance with the culture have less of that turnover that's happening, because people are like, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
Turnover is turnover. Reductions are going to exist. I would say reductions will exist less if you create a culture that we've been talking about, and that I talk about striking by doing it differently, because it's more effective, and not only is it more fun for you and for your team members, it actually makes the company more money.
Yeah.
Because people are thriving, they're being their best selves, they are 100% committed, they're not half till just showing up, doing the bare minimum. So I think it's a tall order, but I think it's one that has to be met with what is the reality of today's landscape.
Yeah.
And how do I create that culture that's going to produce the best results for my team and for the company.
Yeah, I think that's really true. So I think to wrap up this conversation and this interview, reflecting on your own journey, how has your leadership style impacted your personal growth and your relationships with others, both within and outside your organization?
Great question. And I will say this. I have already said that being a leader, you have to invest in your own development, right? And to be a great leader and have a great positive impact on people, you have to do your own work to grow as a person. So I would say that my journey of really striving to satisfy a larger calling for being a leader, to really have an impact on people's lives and to really help them become who they want to become, to help them feel like they belong. All these things has been an evolution for me as well. Because I think in my early days, I couldn't articulate that. There was a sense that that's what I was doing, but I couldn't articulate that. But through my own growth as a leader and as a person and investing in my own growth, I've been able to own that, speak strongly about what I believe in, really take a stand for I'm doing it differently and it works better. And I was shamed in many ways in my early years in leadership in corporate, because it sat outside of what the traditional model of leadership looked like. And what was so interesting and fascinating about that is that it sat outside of that, but I had proven results that my teams produced better. You know, I didn't have the spiral of resignations left and right. I didn't have the staff issues that other teams were dealing with.
Yep.
And I think that as I grew as a person, that only helped me to be a better leader. So I think it's a symbiotic relationship, is developing as a human being and growing and learning, and it flows through your efforts of being able to be a better leader. But more importantly than saying leader is really to have an impact on people.
Yeah.
Right? And that's what I didn't know how to articulate, that now I think I've stepped fully into that and trying to create a movement for more people to take that position.
Yeah.
Because I think not only will it have an impact on the company, whether you own the company, work for the company, but I think it will also have an impact on every person that you touch, right? Every person you touch, it will have an impact on their lives and the people in their lives, right? Their families, their partners, their children, but also society. Because if we're all doing that, it's just going to make it better for everybody. So I know that sounds so big and grandiose, but I really do believe that if you look at the numbers of people that are stressed out at work and that their mental health is affected because of work, I think that we have a lot to do with that. And creating the new wave of leaders is to change that.
Yeah.
So that can be reversed.
Yeah. I think that's so important in any job and any career, especially as a leader. So I thank you for sharing that. And that's all the questions I have.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for doing this. I hope that everybody has enjoyed what we shared here.
Yeah.
And this is one of a series of creating leaders where we'll bring other people on to share their insights and their stories.
Yeah.
And thanks, Liyana, for being the interviewer here and getting me to answer and share my wisdom and insights and beliefs.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
Thank you. Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time on the next episode of Finding the Upside. Bye for now.